tomorrow. So with that, let's get rolling. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Peter. Today, Devan and I are going to talk about transfer of skill and how we make an impact on sport performance. We'd like to thank 1080 Motion, obviously, for putting this on and being able to be a good resource for us in this downtime. We hope everyone around the world is safe and healthy, and thanks for joining us. My name is Chris Stackpole. I'm the Vice President of Athlete Care at the New Jersey Devils, and it's my responsibility within the organization to manage and lead all the departments as they pertain to athlete care, sport performance, and general wellness throughout the whole club.
And my name is Devan McConnell. I'm the Director of Performance Science and Reconditioning Coach with the New Jersey Devils. Essentially, my role is to oversee all of our performance science, sports science, tools and technology and applications. I directly work with our injured athletes whenever necessary to kind of bridge the gap from a return to play standpoint. And I work day to day with the entire team to, just like Chris said, to make sure that we give our athletes the best chance for success.
So a bit of where we're going to take you today, we hope in the first part to go through the science and theory of why we do what we do, to be able to explain the reasoning behind our methods. And then part two, Devan will take you through more of the practical applied side of how we actually implement our training. Next slide, Dev. So the first thing we came with was start with why. Why do we do what we do? And that was a major question that we started asking within the organization of when we approach sport performance and trying to improve the skill of our athletes, why are we doing the specific tasks? So, every exercise that we choose in the weight room and from a medical perspective, we're looking at identifying the purpose behind that and better understanding what it is that we're trying to accomplish with our athletes. So throughout our presentation today, we'll basically step through each one of these 6 steps that have been adapted by Stu and JB Marin. As we go through identifying the specific tasks that we're working on, identifying proper KPIs, and then really studying and understanding the biomechanics of physiology and the basic neuromuscular requirements that these athletes will have to demonstrate in order to improve. And we'll go through this as we go through the entire presentation. Next slide. So one area that we were really struggling and wrestling with was, where do we have the most influence? And as sport performance coaches and physios and medical providers, we're a part of the puzzle when it comes to athletes performing on the ice, and the time and requirements that these athletes have from a professional sporting environment. There's a limited amount of time to train and rehab and recover. So we started breaking down our areas into specific buckets, one being the technical skill, one being the tactical skill, physiology of what's taking place, and then also the psychological. And we really decided to focus most of our energy into the physiological bucket because we think we'd have the most impact, direct impact there. And specifically, we said, well, we believe sprinting and accelerating, we can make an improvement in within all of our athletes. And we believe that we can have some sort of myofascial resiliency that's built throughout our athletes as they continue to train. So we're blending and bridging the gap between rehab and performance so that our athletes can continue pushing the envelope. As we go through the sprinting and acceleration work here, you'll start to see where what we do as sport performance coaches needs to blend with the technical skill coaches. And that's going to be something beyond this talk, but you could see how these buckets, as much as they're separate, they're really interconnected. Next slide. Perfect. So we've identified our task. We want to try to improve acceleration capabilities with our athletes. So one area that we're looking at is we need to describe what's happening in competition. So what's happening in our games and what's happening in our practices, so we can better understand the workloads and the physical outputs that are being accomplished in our training environments. So we'll go into that. We've also done a deep dive into a lot of the biomechanics of what's happening during skating. We've looked at, on the right top part of the screen, the relationships between off-ice and on-ice measures to better understand how we can use our off-ice training to improve on-ice performance. In the last part on the bottom right of the screen, we've decided to find a way to capture in a more granular manner what's happening during the acceleration phase. So not only just looking at the sheer time that players are accomplishing a certain sprint in, but now we can get specific numbers on force, power, etc. So we looked into a method to do that we'll get into. So from a game demands perspective, there's more research coming out now that our NHL league and our minor league system is able to start collecting some of this data, but we've been able to show in our minor league system that there is a certain amount of sprints and accelerations that are occurring within a game setting and a practice setting. So by being able to look at these measures, we're understanding, the changes in workload from the game to practice, the changes in workload from caliber of player, from a top line player to a fourth line player. And we're starting to see what's happening throughout the organization from the NHL to the AHL level. So with a better understanding of what's happening in game, we can start to better tailor the training to players that may need to improve in these acceleration capabilities. So going back to our main point of how we study and work through this, we understand the game measures as we start to dive deeper in those. And then as we get into biomechanics, we're identifying that there's there's for sure two, if not three different mechanics that we need to understand. For one, there's the acceleration mechanics, which are similar to acceleration mechanics in running. And then in hockey, we have gliding mechanics, which would be similar to top end speed mechanics in sprinting. And we need to better understand the differences between the two so that we can start to break down the technical skill that's required in those and also the physiological components that are coming out of those. So if we go into the next slide, we've compiled, and some of this is debatable depending on what research sources you're looking at, but for the most part, we've compiled data that shows these events are happening in acceleration and these events are happening in the glide phase of skating. So in acceleration, we know that the number of times force is applied is an important factor. We know that the directionality of the force in the horizontal direction is important. We know that the amount of force applied with every stride is crucial in accelerating. And we know that it's taking place over a very short time period. So realistically, we're looking at 3 to 4 strides, potentially up to 6 or 8 within a 10-meter distance. And that time perspective is really within a second and a half, up to 2 seconds potentially of time. So it's a really short window that we're trying to maximize efficiency. As we get into the gliding perspective, you can understandably see how things change, where they're getting deeper into their stride. The stride extension velocity matters way more than the amount of turnover, and even the skating mechanics technically are different, whereas acceleration is a more externally rotated demand. Gliding has your feet in a much more neutral pattern. Next slide. So as we start to get into the training parameters, we wanted to better understand what off-ice measures have the most direct correlation with on-ice speed. And so through scouring the research and through our own internal studies, we've identified that most of the linear testing has the most direct correlation to on-ice speed. So anything from a 10-meter sprint, 40-yard dash, or even basic broad or long jumps, those are going to have the most direct relationship to on-ice speed. We're also identifying that a Wingate peak power test on a bike has a very strong correlation to on-ice speed. And contrary to what we initially thought, the counter movement jump or vertical test is actually showing to be less correlated than we initially thought it would be. A lot of the literature has mixed reviews. In our population, we're identifying that counter movement jumps and anything primarily vertical has much less correlation to on-ice sprinting speed. So as we go through, we've identified, game demands. We have a better understanding of the biomechanics, so we can start to identify these norms, and with a better comprehension of what's going on with our off-ice training, where we spend most of our time, we can start putting together a really good package for how we identify what's normal in our population and how we can go about changing it. So now the meat and potatoes of getting into the force and velocity profiling. This is probably the biggest area that we're investing our time and energy in studying, and the area personally I'm most excited about. JB's work has been fantastic for us to be able to use simple measures to get a more fine-tuned view of what's taking place during our acceleration and our sprinting on ice. And we're able to do it, thankfully, with the 1080 Motion hardware and software. So these are just some studies that we've gone through, and thankfully Jerome and his colleagues are publishing more and more on how JB's initial work is being valid and reliable in the hockey context. So it's really powerful to see that you know, our NHL world and our professional hockey world is starting to show the same capabilities that sports like soccer and rugby have been showing thus far. So for those of you not familiar with the force velocity profiling, basically we're able to take an athlete through a full sprint in the horizontal direction, obviously, and then we can also test athletes in a vertical direction with counter movement jumps of loaded intensities. So for the horizontal, we're able to look at measures like horizontal theoretical max force and max velocity to understand how players get from point A to point B. We can generate a maximal mechanical power output. We can identify the ratio of force, which is that RF value listed there on the left. That basically is giving us the relationship between the amount of force directed vertically versus the amount of force directed horizontally. We get not only the average over a certain distance, but also the max value that's achieved. And we also get a rate of decrease in the ratio of force, meaning as you increase in sprinting speed, the amount of force directed horizontally into the ground tends to decrease. So that decrement that we're looking at is the decrease of RF. As we shift gears to the vertical side, we get very similar numbers, vertical peak, max force, vertical max speed, max power, but here slightly different. We're able to look at a theoretical optimal profile based on the athlete's height, leg extension, and body weight, and compare it to what they're actually outputting. So we can find that FVIMB number on the bottom, which is the imbalance between the optimal and the actual, as we potentially start to shift players to being able to use their body to the best of their abilities. Next slide, please. So practically, how is this done? We use our 1080 sprint machine. We have our athletes go on the ice, and we typically go from a dead start through at least 30 meters of distance. And we're able to get the raw output that's seen on the screen here for all of their split times, but as well just start to finish. And what we do is we take that data off of the 1080 website and we get the raw values and we extract it into our R software and are able to create an entire force velocity profile for the entire team. And this helps us just being able to do things very efficiently and quickly. And the 1080 software has been fantastic to be able to do this without the traditional method of what JB's research was initially started with timing gates and 5-meter splits that you would have to enter into a specific Excel template. Perfect. So as we take all that data and we start assessing our players, our goal ultimately is to identify norms in the beginning, because right now it hasn't been shown in hockey what a normal force velocity profile looks like in horizontal sprinting. So our first step is to identify, well, what's happening within our population. And if you look to the right of the screen, you'll see the fastest players in that 10-meter time, and then you'll see our slower players. And you could see as the values change and as the parameters change, you know, our fastest players are producing a certain amount of force within that sprint phase. They're producing a certain amount of power, and their directionality of the force applied is better than the slower athletes. So just in that sense, we at least have a benchmark to know, okay, what numbers should we be seeking to increase our slower players towards, and we can start to understand better which variables are most important. So in this context, the force and power and directionality are the 3 variables out of the many that we've collected that seem to be the most relevant for improving sprint time. And that's not even considering the technical skill of sprinting, which we're not even going to cover in this lecture from an on-ice perspective. As you look over to the left of the screen, with work that we've done with a consultant, we're actually able to use some machine learning algorithms and place on a line where this athlete is in relation to the team, his peers per position group, but also in relation to what this athlete's optimal may be. So if you look on the top left in that FO box, you'll see a blue circle going down the slope of a line. That blue circle represents where that athlete is in time. And theoretically, the goal would be to get him into that gray box where the rest of his population is. And so what we're able to do here is see all the variables in a snapshot to see where this athlete is potentially most efficient, and then seek to find ways to improve those numbers, either through the technical skill of skating or through our on-ice or off-ice training. And so for this athlete in particular, we're noticing Pmax and the bottom two variables, primarily the average directionality of the force, the RF average 10 meter. He's the furthest away from his group norms on that. So we would potentially theorize that we need to make this athlete more explosive, more powerful, and generate more force on ice, as well as get better technical abilities in skating. So you can see how when we're able to break down these numbers and start to potentially characterize athletes, we can start to identify what areas guys need to work on. An interesting note that we found is not everyone has the same profile. So you have athletes who are very fast on the ice who are not very strong in the weight room. And you have athletes who are very strong in the weight room but are not very fast on ice, despite what you would think. So we're able to better understand what's actually happening from a transfer of skill perspective from off ice to on ice. And this force velocity profiling has been extremely helpful for having us better understand what it is our athletes are capable of accomplishing.
All right, so we'll kind of shift gears a little bit. Stack did a fantastic job sort of describing the foundation from a scientific standpoint about how we're thinking about training, what's important, and how to go about actually influencing change with our athletes in the very limited amount of time that we have. I'm going to shift now into a little bit more of our sort of philosophy of start to get into the how we're doing what we're doing and some of the applied stuff. So our Devil's performance big rocks, as we say, our philosophy and priorities are probably not earth-shattering for anybody, but these kind of set the stage for us as far as directing us where we want to go, keeping our sort of vision and mission in check, and making sure that everybody's on the same page. So from a philosophy standpoint, number one is do no harm, and that's probably pretty well understood across the board. Our number one job really in training is to make sure that we're not doing any harm. Our athletes need to be able to get on the ice and compete every day, and if we're doing something to stand in the way of that, then that's a big problem. Minimal effective dose is a big piece of the puzzle for that, both from the standpoint of, again, minimizing risk of potential harm, but also, again, from sort of a philosophical standpoint that I'll get into a little bit as we go, that we really believe the minimal effective dose in most cases is the most appropriate way to apply training load and training stress to our athletes. Again, keeping in mind where we sit from a sports performance standpoint in the bigger, grander scheme of the organizational's goals. And then from a general to specific kind of framework from a training standpoint, which again, I'll detail a little bit what I mean by that. From a priority standpoint, number one, first and foremost, is to improve resilience. Again, going along with do no harm, our biggest goal is to minimize man games lost, especially from a soft tissue kind of non-contact injury standpoint. We really believe that our number one job is to keep our athletes as healthy as possible so that they can practice, so they can develop as hockey players, and they can compete every day. Number two then is to improve performance, and a lot of what Stack has outlined is what goes into understanding what performance is. Specifically today, we're talking a lot about skating and acceleration, but obviously there'll be some different areas that we could talk about with goaltenders and with defensemen and exactly what performance means, but understanding the underlying biomechanics and physiology of our athletes is a big component of that. And then KPIs, key performance indicators, is really about having a why. We want to make sure that everything that we're doing in training is improving the ability to move on the ice. And that's really what transferability is about to us, that every decision we're making is through that initial lens, that this exercise or this modality or this movement pattern ultimately we need to be able to back that up with why we're doing it, and the why really needs to improving the ability for the athlete to move on the ice. And then the idea that transferability has layers, again, from general to specific in what we're doing. We're going to talk a lot about the specifics of what we're doing and some unique case studies and examples, but by no means does that mean that we're not paying attention to or spending time from a more of a general standpoint as well, which again really creates the foundation from a training perspective. And along those lines, we kind of think in terms of the Bondarchuk big rocks, as I call them, and I'm by no means a Bondarchuk disciple, so if I butcher this in any way to those that are, I apologize, but this is a great framework for our team and our group to be able to understand where and when we need to apply certain exercises, how they fit into our paradigm, how they fit into our bigger picture. And I won't spend a ton of time here, people are probably familiar, but at the bottom we've got general prep exercises. And for us, this is all of our, our traditional strength and conditioning work that are nuts and bolts, everything that everybody else is probably doing. Traditional weight room type exercises develop strength and power and resilience. Specific prep exercises are where we'll talk a lot about today. These are exercises for the most part that are being performed in the weight room, but are starting to take on a little bit more of the qualities of what's happening in the sport from a directionality standpoint, from a force vector standpoint, from a velocity or a loading standpoint, things that start to resemble the skating stride and what happens on the ice a little bit more, but are still taking place for the most part in the weight room. Specific development exercises are where we start to bridge the gap onto the ice, and we actually start to take some of our training onto the ice when it's applicable and necessary, and this oftentimes is in the form of resisted sprinting with the 1080 sprint. And then ultimately the competitive exercises is skating, and it's what happens in practice and in the game. And this is where we kind of start and we work backwards to understand, as we've tried to show here today, what's really important and what goes into improving those things. Charlie Francis, Big Rocks, again, this is sort of a foundational component to how we think about training and the lens through which we apply training. Again, I won't spend a ton of time here, but the general idea from Charlie Francis is to avoid the middle. We're trying to not spend a lot of time in this medium intensity zone, whatever intensity is going to mean. We think of it more in terms of kind of load and nervous system, whereas Charlie Francis, originally was talking about specific speeds on the track with his elite sprinters. But the principle of the idea is we want to spend most of our time in this high intensity area when we do have access to our athletes, which again is very minimal at the NHL level. And this goes back to our minimal effective dose. We're going to try to apply high intensity, highly concentrated, micro dosed approach to our training paradigm. And then just as a sort of general framework of what a typical day may look like from progression from the weight room to the ice is going to essentially follow this guideline. And whether or not we kind of touch on each of these components on a day-to-day basis or not, this at least provides a framework for how we think about the integration of the performance staff, our medical staff, and what happens on the ice. And it's going to be pretty traditional from the standpoint of beginning with mobility and soft tissue therapy, whether that be self-myofascial release or working with our massage therapist, fascial tension type work, and torso, hip, motor control will show a little bit of that, but it's essentially going to be a combination of concepts from FRC as well as using isokinetic resistance with the 1080 quantum to create tension through the system, then into our general prep, special prep, et cetera, into our on ice work.
So from a practical perspective, our mobility and fascial tension work, we believe that it's important in order for our athletes to be able to train on a daily basis. We have to remove 90% of the basic little problems that they're going to have so that they can maintain their training continuity the best possible. So from a soft tissue perspective, our medical staff and massage therapists are spending a lot of time with each athlete on a routine basis, going through the soft tissue to make sure that myofascially everything is intact and they feel to the best of their ability. And we have our athletes go through a specific self-massage protocol as well, so that they're staying in touch with what their bodies need. And so there's a good balance between having athletes be responsible for their own bodies, but then also lean on us as medical providers to provide the hands-on care that they may not be able to do by themselves. From a mobility perspective, we follow the basic FRC or PRI methodologies where we're looking to attack the major joints that are involved in our sport, being the ankle, our hips, and the T-spine. And doing so, we're trying to get athletes to have better control of the motion that they require. So in hockey, we have a lot of posterior hip restriction, a decent amount of ankle and foot restriction because they're in a boot, and then obviously asymmetric T-spine rotation because of their shooting sport. So we have specific strategies built out to address each of these joints and be able to maximize the control that the players have at all these levels. And then we take that into the fascial tension perspective because we want to get the body used to being able to generate tension in a 360-degree pattern. So we'll use different tools, including the 1080 Quantum, to get our players to create tension in cross-body patterns, front-to-back patterns, following all the basic tenets of FRC, DNS, etc., to be able to get our bodies balanced so that they can correct what they've now changed or used in the sport, so they can be returned back to a baseline. So from a torso motor control perspective, we follow a lot of the Bosch principles where we're looking for that hip lock. And as you can see in the bottom right picture, you'll see the stance leg compared to the swing leg, and the swing leg pelvis is on a higher level compared to the stance leg pelvis. And that's basically the hip lock principle that we're looking for. There's a certain rotation to the pelvis that's occurring. There's a certain elevation of the pelvis on the swing side that's occurring. And there's a certain counter rotation in the torso that the combination of the three really allows the extension mechanics of the leg to be optimal. So a lot of our torso motor control principles are looking to get the players to use their hips and their torso properly so that they can have the least pelvic health issues throughout the season. And so far it's been successful with the amount of soft tissue work that we provide, as well as this motor control principle. So here's some examples of our basic progression through our motor control. You can see on the top left, we start, depending on a player's abilities, we start on the ground teaching basic mechanics of using the diaphragm, creating the proper posterior pelvic tilt to stabilize the torso, and then teach dissociation from there. So in that example, we're working on a DNS type dead bug where the athlete is creating co-contraction in the torso, properly using the diaphragm and rib cage to stabilize and getting proper segmentation of the legs as he goes from a flexion extension pattern. Once the athletes are proving competent on the ground, we then elevate them to the bottom picture where we're working on a leaning tower series, primarily trying to teach lumbopelvic dissociation. So can we get the spine and the hip to move separately, and to do it with proper shin angles? Because our athletes, this player in particular was coming back from an ankle injury. Our athletes, because they spend so much time in an externally rotated pattern in some sort of lumbar hyperlordosis, we're trying to get them back into a neutral alignment to teach them how to counteract the forces that they're going through on a daily basis. So once we're able to teach those dissociation patterns, we move to the middle picture where we have our athletes work on what we call step to box series. And this is adapted from a lot of the the Franz Bosch work and from Bill Knowles to be able to teach proper pushing mechanics and extension mechanics. So you can see Ryan Podell there, he's doing a basic step to box with an overhead reach, but his front leg is getting that positive shin angle, and he's using the hip lock mechanics that we're teaching to get the proper reflexive step mechanics. So it's a really good exercise if you haven't seen it, to be able to teach the proper pushing mechanics and the progression from the lumbopelvic dissociation. And then the last picture on the right is our final wall series, basically, that we've adapted from what John Pryor's has taught us to really get that hip lock. And you can kind of see his left hip compared to his right. The right hip is elevated compared to the left. He's got a good extension pattern of that left leg, and he's incorporating the torso with the rotation mechanics to really lock everything in. So we feel this progression, in addition to all the soft tissue maintenance that we're doing, is the best way to keep our athletes' pelvis healthy. And thus far, it's proved very successful for us.
So now getting into the skating stride, which again is our, our competitive exercise, and at the end of the day is the thing we're probably most trying to influence. This is forward skating. For those of you that are maybe not well versed in ice hockey, the skating stride, and Stack talked about this at the beginning, is really a multiplanar motion. You have a couple different things happening here. You have a transition from acceleration mechanics that are fairly similar to land-based acceleration over the first few strides, with the exception of a large externally rotated femur that allows basically to overcome the frictionless environment that we live in. And then as the athlete accelerates and gets closer and closer and closer to max velocity, the mechanics change as they would in land-based sprinting to a more upright posture, but the action of the legs is very different from land-based sprinting, where we end up becoming more and more frontal plane dominant at higher velocities. So there's a lot going on, not even to speak of sort of the upper body rotational component and what's happening there. But this is really sort of the challenge that we're working with, is better understanding what is actually happening biomechanically during skating, again, from sort of a general perspective or general picture, and then being able to understand within our group, within our organization, what our different athletes' tendencies, strengths, and weaknesses are, and what types of things that we really need to work on to achieve. And this is the first video, Peter, if you want to cue that up. We're going to show lateral skater push, which is become a staple in our training program. So essentially what we have here is a high force, low velocity, frontal plane, for lack of a better term, squat. This is a movement pattern that is obviously really important in ice hockey, is fairly unique in the skating stride. Again, at higher velocities, we become very frontal plane dominant, but it's a movement pattern that's been very challenging to load from a high load, kind of low velocity standpoint with more traditional means. And being able to use the 1080 quantum has allowed us to essentially attack almost like a absolute force, max strength perspective. Shift back. Sort of an absolute high force, absolute strength perspective. And essentially what we're doing with this exercise specifically, we use this as we use this as a testing baseline to understand at very low, again, very low velocities, so the athlete's able to produce very high force outputs as a baseline testing and assessment. But we also use it on a weekly basis from a training perspective to be able to load the athletes in a similar fashion to what would be a traditional kind of a 3-rep max type of idea in a front squat or something like that. But now we're moving into that sort of special prep exercise area. And if you notice in the screen, on the computer screen, it says 0.25. That's 0.25 meters per second is the speed that we set this at for our testing purposes. And the reason for that is it's essentially the speed that Dr. Brian Mann found to correlate with essentially a 1 rep max or a terminal repetition in a squat when using GymAware or a Tendo unit. So what we're doing here is essentially governing the athlete to not be able to move faster than what they would be able to do in a traditional kind of 1 rep max attempt, where they wouldn't be able to complete another rep. But because of the lack of eccentric overload with the way that we're setting this up, we can get multiple reps at this very low speed where the athlete is able to produce very high levels of force. So again, this is the idea of taking an exercise or a movement pattern that is important to the sport, important to the game, that has traditionally only been able to be performed at low load, high velocity, plyometric, bounding type exercises. And now we're able to essentially train it at a different point of the force velocity spectrum, more at the force end of the picture. So it's a really unique way that we're able to start to attack some of the special development with our athletes. And one of the great things about the 1080 equipment is the data that we can get on the back end. So what you have here are the force traces of that specific exercise of 2 different athletes. So we can look at this after the fact from a number of perspectives, one from a performance and a profiling perspective, and also from a return to play perspective. The top graph, it says high peak force late in the movement. What you essentially see here is this sort of slow, long buildup of force output with a sharp peak and then a quick drop off. In this particular case, this athlete is not producing necessarily high levels of force early in the push, but high levels of force near extension of the leg. At the bottom, we have high peak force early in the movement. So this athlete has a sharp ramp up of force. They maintain a high level over some amount of time, and then they have a little bit slower drop off. So this individual is producing force early in the push, early in the stride, and being able to maintain that. And we're currently looking at and trying to correlate to see if these traces and this data correlates from land-based work like we're doing to our on-ice 1080 metrics. Because what we see with some of our athletes on the ice, the top graph would be similar to what we would expect to see with an athlete that is not necessarily a good accelerator, but has high max velocity characteristics. They're able to produce force not necessarily early in their push, but later in their stride and maintain that at as they're moving at high velocities. Whereas the bottom graph might look a little bit more like somebody who can accelerate very well. So those are some things that we're currently looking at from a performance bucketing standpoint, but we'll also use this information from a return to play and a baselining standpoint. If we have somebody coming back from a lower body injury, we can have them on the machine and see, are their left and right legs, the gray and the yellow, are the traces lining up similarly, or are they quite different from a force or a power output standpoint? Regardless of which trace is theirs, we can look back and see, well, what did they look like earlier in the year when they weren't injured, and we can start to understand where they are in the return to play process. The next pattern that's pretty unique to hockey that we're trying to address is this crossover drive. And I say over in quotation marks because, again, if you're not overly familiar with hockey and ice skating, what's actually occurring and where we're getting the bulk of our propulsion during this movement is this underleg. So although the right leg is crossing over the left leg is actually driving into the ice and creating most of the force. So we call it a crossover, but it's really a cross under. And we've started to train this exercise as well. Peter, if you want to cue up video 2 for this. Basically, what we're going to be able to do is very similar to that lateral push, that skater push exercise. So essentially what we're going to be able to do here is very similar to our lateral push exercise. We're going to be able to load that front leg in that cross under posture. and really be able to create high levels of force in a movement pattern that's specific to the game, specific to the sport, but until now has been fairly challenging to find ways to, again, address the force end of the force velocity spectrum with that. That is an exercise we're using from a developmental standpoint, but it's also served as an important piece in a return to play case study that I'll show from a growing adductor standpoint. So in this example, we have an athlete in our system that was having essentially an adductor return to play problem that was just sort of not able to make progress in, and it was something that he came to us with. And you basically see a progression from left to right, talking about some of the leaning tower and hip lock exercises that Chris talked about, and adding into this component this low velocity, higher force adduction flexion exercise using the quantum. And the great thing about using the isokinetic setting with this in the return to play standpoint is that we can set the speed to wherever we need to be to allow the athlete to self-govern. So in his case, he was having pain and dysfunction at higher velocities. So we wanted to start him out at low velocity to create tension through the system, reteach how he moved and his movement patterns with pictures 1 and 2, and then start to create some tension and some strength throughout the system in a more specific pattern. Video 3, if Peter will throw it up, is sort of a continuation of that thought process, transitioning the athlete from those low velocity movements into higher and higher velocity training. What we have here is essentially a three-phase progression where we started out with mostly concentric only at lower load. Now we're going into a kind of a rapid eccentric pattern, and we're combining those two eventually into a higher velocity, lower load movement pattern. So again, we've taken the athlete from a mechanics standpoint, reteaching, re-educating proper pushing mechanics into a low velocity, higher load area where the athlete's comfortable and able to start to move through a specific motor pattern, and then finally into a higher speed, higher velocity component. The next phase of our return to play with this athlete was to then take him onto the ice using the 1080 sprint in a manner to govern his velocity component on the ice, because again, he was having pain at higher velocities. He could get out and skate at a low to moderate speed without any dysfunction or pain, but when he started to speed up is where we were running into problems. If you could start this video, Peter. So essentially, what we did on the ice with the 1080 was take the athlete from higher resistance, lower speed, and sort of taper down into lower resistance, higher speed. So we were able to set the loading parameters on the 1080 sprint to essentially keep this athlete in acceleration mechanics, where he could create high force, but he could be comfortable because the speed at which he was able to move was governed. And then as he progressed over time, we were able to decrease the load on the system, which in turn increased the velocity he was able to skate as tissue tolerance improved, and eventually he was able to return to play. And then the fifth video, single leg squat, is again an exercise we used in the return to play continuum, but also has direct implication into acceleration force and acceleration mechanics. And as this queues up and plays, what you'll see is an eccentrically overloaded, isokinetically resisted pattern that we're able to really create high levels of force in this sort of specific acceleration type pattern, but also overload the system eccentrically in a way that we're not able to do necessarily with other traditional means like sled marching. So I'm able to create as much force as possible in the propulsion part of the phase, but we're also able to utilize the eccentric function to add tension into the system for the return to play scenario where the athlete needs to resist that motion on the way back towards the machine. Perfect. Goaltenders are kind of the next area that I want to talk about. And if you're, again, I keep kind of coming back, if you're not familiar with hockey, what I want you to appreciate here is just the hip positions and lower body positions that our goaltenders have to get into. Because some of the things that we're going to do specifically with our goaltenders from a preparation standpoint are directly designed to offset and manage some of the unique stresses that they have to go into. We have huge and forceful internal rotation components of the hips that are necessary, but also detrimental to the hip complex. We have end range, extreme end range positions like this that the athlete has to get into multiple times in a game or a practice, where they need to be able to not only get into and out of these positions, but display strength and stability at these end ranges. That again creates a unique challenge from a loading standpoint in more traditional strength and conditioning manners, but we're able to utilize some of the concepts talked about earlier in the isokinetic work with the 1080 to hopefully apply some stresses to these athletes that are unique but specific to their needs. As an example of what that might look like from a goaltender prep program, I wanted to share sort of a general template of something we might go through pre-practice. We would start with soft tissue prep. Again, that may be self-guided, that may be with physio or with a massage therapist, that might be a combination of both. Then we're going to go into some of our growing prep work, which is in this case the 90-90 IR lift is very FRC inspired, as well as the tall kneeling floor push, where we're essentially trying to create tension through that adductor and hip complex at end ranges. The movement prep, we'll start to incorporate diagonal, Bosch, step to box type exercises, so we start to get on our feet and move through some slightly more specific goaltender specific patterns. 1080 reverse VH rotation. The reverse VH is a position that goaltenders get into that is not hip friendly, so to speak, but we're able to utilize the 1080 again with an isokinetic setting to create some tension and some strength in these fairly unique postures and positions that they have to get into. This is an example of an exercise, not one that was listed there, but something that we might take goaltender through pre-practice. Goaltender specific resisted movement utilizing the what's that strap. So we have a rotational component with the strap that we have to offset. The goaltender has to be able to stabilize against, and then it's just a sort of a goalie specific plyometric jump progression that we would go through. That might be a kind of end stage warm up activity for the goaltender before they head into the locker room to put their equipment on. This is a Bosch-esque crossover drive. I say that again just because it's a concept borrowed that we're constantly tinkering with, and again, not exactly what I had listed on the outline, but it gives you an example of how we might utilize some of these concepts in our prep phase prior to the athlete getting onto the ice and performing what they need to do. The last couple things I want to leave you with are a couple more specific applications. This idea of finding the 1% is another sort of foundational philosophical idea. It's the idea of marginal gains that most people are familiar with at this point. We're trying to find as many 1% areas that we can make improvements and help our athletes and help our organization. A lot of that oftentimes comes from conversations with the athletes themselves. Obviously, to play at this level, to play in the National Hockey League, you have to be one of the top, roughly 700 people in the world to play the sport. And these athletes, I find, oftentimes have a unique ability to understand the physical characteristics and the things that they need to perform well on the ice. And when you have examples of these athletes who are also able to verbalize some of those things, it's really important to listen to what they have to say, because they'll lend you some great ideas that will help find some of these 1% areas that we can make improvements in. An example of that is a rotational shooting complex here. That picture from before is an athlete taking a slap shot. Again, the rotational exercise that we're going through and complex with the rotational med ball throw. The med ball throw is pretty standard, something that has been a piece of the puzzle at every level for a long time. What we haven't been able to do very well is apply load at that high force end of the force velocity spectrum. So again, we're able to utilize the 1080 quantum in a unique way, in a very specific pattern, to create some tension, create some load, and some strength abilities that maybe we weren't able to in the past. And then we can complex that with more traditional means like the med ball throw to try to achieve increased velocities and power outputs. And then again, just to come back to that idea of listening to your athletes and how important that is. The individual on the top right, number 5, one of the smartest athletes I've ever had the good fortune of working with, and he was kind of describing to me when we were performing a traditional kind of anti-rotation stability based exercise to me about how what he actually had to do on the ice was similar, but it was different, because he may need to be able to box an athlete out from kind of one angle, while at the same time looking in a different direction to follow the play, and at the same time kind of being jostled and having this sort of on again, off again force aspect to the movement. And because we had access obviously to this equipment, we started to play around with some ideas to see if we could mimic some of that. And what we kind of came up with was this defensive positioning with reflexive overload. So we're able to add load to the 1080 and then overload the eccentric component. So essentially what ends up happening is the athlete is trying to kind of fight off this eccentric force with a little bit of a give and take that creates this very dynamic anti-rotation stability based pattern, but at the same time is a little bit unique and a little bit more specific to what's actually happening on the ice. And then to kind of wrap things up, hopefully some takeaways for you guys with our summary. Really, we wanted to try to illustrate what transferability meant to us, and for us, it's understanding the competitive exercise. We've done a deep dive, and we continue to do a deep dive to better understand what that actually looks like and how to define that, so that we have an idea of what's actually happening with our athletes in the competitive exercise, in the game. And then we want to better understand how can we influence this. This is the foundational component to the game. We need to better understand what's happening and how to train it. We want to progress in an intelligent and methodical manner, from general to specific. And we've outlined some of those progressions and some of that thought process. And we also want to follow a KPI-driven model where we have a why behind what we're doing, that everything we're trying to apply in the weight room or on the ice from a training perspective has a reason and has an end goal. And then finally, combine concepts to produce an integrated model, improving resilience and sports performance holistically. We want to be able to think inside and outside the box to achieve our goals. I know that's about the full time. I think we're going to do a separate Q&A at some point, but I can be reached if anybody does have specific questions at the email, and I'm fairly active on Twitter, and this is Chris's email as well.
Well, thank you so much, Chris and Devin. That was a truly interesting and a really good presentation. Much appreciated, and I'm sure from the amount of questions we have received here, there's a lot of interest. So yes, we will do a separate Q&A session that we record and put it out on our website together with the video capture of the session. I'm going to make sure here I get my so again, thanks a lot, guys. That was fantastic. And it's time to wrap up today, and just want to give you a little bit of notice here for next week's seminar. Devin, you referred a lot to JB Moran's research on force velocity profiling, and JB will be joining us next week. The session is fully booked, so that you cannot sign up for it now, but again, we will record this and make it available for people to watch afterwards. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining. It's been great, great interest, and we'll just keep on pushing this here and invite more great speakers who have interesting things to share with you. We appreciate your feedback. Send us an email. Here's our contact information, and of course, here's our social media feeds that you can listen into as well. So with that, thank you so much, everybody. Stay safe out there, and see you next week.